Oh, man. There we go. Okay. Is this gonna work? I think we're live. We're going live. Okay. So hopefully some of you can see this. I don't love it, but I think this is actually going to work. So you should be able to see what I see now. This is a live stream share. I don't know if you can hear me, if you can see me. There's no one in the room, and I don't have any like setup, so I don't know if it's actually playing live. Hopefully it is. I do have the chat, so you can ask me questions. Okay, perfect. Okay, so um, this is going to have to be the way we do it now. Look, I can tell, like I can see that the window looks awful right now, but I'm in the live stream. When I go back, I can't see your chat. So right now, all of you should be looking at the actual federal courts, the Chapter 15. We didn't finish this, so it's fine. I know it looks like I'm jumping ahead, but I think we were here. And so that's the full screen. I'm going to be talking over this. And then at times when I want to talk directly to you, I can do a switch over. And we're going to do segmented portions. So because this is a little more difficult, I'm going to do a section at a time. We'll do like an hour, and then we'll take a break. And I really just want to make sure everyone's getting his best possible opportunity to see these. So they should pop up. If they don't, I think they're going to show up. Hopefully it's live and it's recorded and going into the way that it has been with the other recordings. If not, I'm in trouble. So we're going to keep doing this. You can see, I can't split screen yet because I can't get the camera to work while this is happening. But hopefully this gives you a way to see what I'm doing while we're also doing that. So, okay, look, I can jump in there. Okay, so we talked about before I get in chapter 15, I did grade your papers. I did get a paper grade submission. So let me just start by going back, because I did a video, but let me go back to the web campus, right? This is the student view. So the first thing, right, is I should have been a video. I don't see it's up yet, so hopefully it'll show up in a second. But you should be able to see your grade, and with 3 exams and the paper and the assignments in, you can just look at the number and that's your grade. The other part is if you were concerned about if you're concerned about the paper, go back and read the prompt. And you should see where I took off points for not like clearly following the prompt. That's the first step. The second step is I realized that we just didn't have enough time to interact, right? I only had 2 or 3 students in the actual classroom, right? There are only so many students who are doing the live stream when it actually is on, and that's fine. Like the problem is we were put in a classroom that was supposed to be an in-person classroom. By design, it didn't have the technology that it's supposed to have. This room doesn't have the technology it's supposed to have. And so our communication with each other was problematic. So because of that, and because a couple of other projects came off my plate, I'm going to do something. If you don't like your paper grade, email me, and as long as you are doing the exams and you finish all the assignments, we'll talk about how and where you can resubmit. What would be the process for you resubmitting, right? You have to get my permission, express permission to resubmit, but that is a possibility so that you can improve your grade, right? And I'm going to start working and talking to students, but I'm going to do this based on need, and the way that I define need is the people with the lowest grade are going to be my top priority. So if you have a C or lower, I'm going to be contacting you. I'm going to be on top of you, right? I'm going to be more involved. If you are at a B plus or higher, I'm not going to be involved because you may be okay with whatever grade you're at, B plus or higher, and I'm not going to push on you. But also, I don't need to do that as much, right? If you're already an A, there's no communication that we're probably going to have unless you want to talk about something that we're covering later in the semester. So just be prepared for that. So with that being said, I really hope this is recording. It is live, so the live stream is there. You should be able to see it from my page. So let's get back into chapter 15. I'm pretty sure we talked about original jurisdiction, so I'm not gonna go too far back. And I do want to catch up. So The next part is this idea of due process of law. No, we talked about this. Okay, hold on. Because I know I talked about it. I don't know too far apart. Talked about court packing. Talked about publications. We talked about judicial review, how it's very important. We talked about Hamdi versus Rumsfeld. These are the court cases. Okay, so I'll do a little bit of review here, right? Remember that the way that common law occurs is a case creates new requirements in the law, right? And the most obvious example is in this sort of Gideon v. Wainwright, Escobedo v. Illinois, and Miranda v. Arizona. So these three court cases really establish some Miranda rights. You have a right to legal counsel, right? This is right. You have a right to remain silent, so you don't violate your Fifth Amendment, and you have a right to be notified, right? Why do we have this like saying in the United States, very unique to the United States, right? You have a right to remain silent, right? You have a right to an attorney. If you can't afford one, will be provided from you, right? Anything you say will be used against you, right? These rights come from these cases directly, right? This is not legislation that was passed through Congress. This is common law, in that these cases set a precedent where behavior had to follow certain legal statutes. And so common law is very important in this process. Okay. I can't actually like tell, but if you have questions, I'll be switching back and forth. Okay. So make sure you know some of these cases. You really should know Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus the Board of Education, right? Those are the case. Plessy versus uphold segregation, and Brown versus the Board of Education in segregation, legal segregation, right? We'll talk about de jure, de facto again. But you need to know those cases. It's one of the rare times you need to know the names, because the names tell you about what's being covered. And remember, it's open note, open book. So I would make sure that you have this slide available. I'm sure I'm going to ask you questions about cases. I particularly like this because it explains how things go about. I like the why of things. So just make sure that you're looking at this. We already talked about this. There is three criteria, right? One of the big ones is standing, right? You have to have a substantial stake in the outcome of a case to file suit, right, in the very first place, right? So make sure that you know this, right? Standing, right, has to exist. It can't be moot, right, which means it actually has to matter. It requires resolution. And then controversy. And controversy is the big thing. Two circuit courts have to give different answers, right? If all the courts agree, there's no controversy. So when we're talking about Supreme Court cases, a lot of it is because the Ninth Court, right, the court that we are in, the Ninth District, often is different. The West Coast and East Coast districts are different from the Midwest district. And so that might be conservative, liberal, whatever, right? But it works in a very specific way. And then I talked about how a Supreme Court case could get all the way to the Supreme Court, right? And that is part of this ideologically driven clerks, right? So when you clerk for a Supreme Court justice, and I don't know this from personal experience, but we all know this, that they read the cases that come in front of them, they write up some document, and they suggest to their boss, the Supreme Court justice, whether or not it should be taken up. And so because the clerks have a lot of influence over these judges, there's worry about them being ideologically driven or manipulating their bosses. Now, everyone here is a legal expert, but it is possible that a law clerk could undersell or oversell a case. And because they're sort of randomly, they go to a certificate, a certiorari pool, is that they randomly get assigned to different justices. So if you get assigned to a justice who is conservative and a clerk is conservative, but they don't completely agree, that case may never get heard by the Supreme Court, right? The way in which cases, it takes a lot to get a case in there. The next part is this idea of a Solicitor General. Okay, the Solicitor General exists specifically, in large part, to either defend the United States, right, in the court, or to sue a state, right? The Solicitor General rarely, if it's Maryland versus the United States, it's the state versus the Solicitor General representing the United States. So this is a government lawyer. It's an attorney with a great deal of experience, and they often engage in sort of defending the state and saying this is constitutional, right? A lot of times, Solicitor General is saying this is constitutional. When we talk about enhanced interrogation, right? When in the early 2000s, when we're talking about waterboarding and other techniques, there was this concept of enhanced interrogation. And the Solicitor General was very successful in getting the Supreme Court to say that's not torture, and therefore enhanced interrogation is constitutional, right? That was a decision that was made. There are interest groups and lobbying, but because you have to have standing, it has to be the right case and the right client. So if you, right, there was a case that didn't actually go as far as we thought, but there was a teacher that didn't want to be part of the teachers union, right? So you had the right client, right? This was a teacher, didn't want to be part of the union. They have standing. They pay fees. They pay union fees. They don't want to be part of that union. They have a substantial stake. There were some district court decisions in which it was not clear whether or not unions were acceptable among different states. So you had the right case, but what you didn't have is the right political climate. As this case started moving in the courts, we also had election concerns, and then we had COVID. And so many things that were normally a concern are no longer a concern. Remember, it would be moot if there are no schools, right? It doesn't matter if this person's part of a union if they're not working. And they don't want to damage that union while they're not working and the union is providing them benefits. So it has to be the right political climate. So even though we expected the Supreme Court to be insulated, there still is a political climate at play. Okay. So when you go to the Supreme Court, it is quite different. The first thing is that most of the work is done through briefs, right? And briefs are written documents, right? And amicus curiae is a friend of the court brief, right? Sort of giving all of the precedents, all the courts, right? So what happens is every side, all the lobby groups, all the right, the Solicitor General, anyone who's involved in this case, they write up all the documents, and then they give the documents to the Supreme Court justices, and they read all of these, right? So one of the things that's different about a normal court versus an appeals court or Supreme Court is everyone knows what arguments are going to make. They know the documents, they know the briefs, they know the cases. There aren't surprises, right? It's not this big thing where if you're just better and have a silver tongue, or you're better at speaking to people, you're going to be more successful, right? The big part about this is that the oral arguments that occur, right, are really there for them to present positions, right? The first thing is say, this is why I think this is constitutional, unconstitutional, whatever their argument is, why this should change. And then also to answer questions. Now, often what will happen is most of the justices sort of align where you would expect them to align, right? It used to be a 4-4 split with Chief Justice John Roberts sort of as a moderate, right? 4 liberals, 4 conservatives. And the way they interpreted the Constitution was slightly different, and they sort of set in the center. Now we have a more conservative Supreme Court, but when you're presenting oral arguments, that's the opportunity for a justice who may not already be decided or may want clarification to ask a question of that individual who's presenting their oral argument and sort of have them clarify some positions, have them clarify why they chose certain cases, and that's all there. And then one of the most private things that happens is the Supreme Court, they go and they have a conference, and it's just the 9 of them. There are no recordings, there are no right cameras, there isn't anyone else there, and amongst them they come to a decision. And the way that they come to a decision is the majority has a majority opinion, and that changes either the law or it deems some law unconstitutional. And so when you're writing an opinion, it's just an explanation of why the decision occurred. Now, what you will see a lot of times is one person will be tasked, the person who's most adamant about this is tasked with writing the opinion. So after they write the opinion, they say, this is what I expect. And sometimes other people will have a concurring opinion. This says that I agree with the person writing the majority opinion, and these are the reasons why. And both of these things matter, but the original opinion is what changes the law. Now, what became a common occurrence in the late 20th century is you started writing a dissenting opinion. So the majority opinion is what actually changes the law. The dissenting opinion doesn't actually change the law, but it's a way in which the minority can express why they have a different reasoning in this specific case. And so, very unfortunately, right now, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to read her dissenting opinion from the bench, right? She would sit on the bench and she would read her dissenting opinion. And while it was not the opinion that became law or that created common law, it did produce a social climate where she was pointing out specific injustices or specific things that she degraded, right? She was reading her dissent from the bench. From the Supreme Court bench is a very powerful place to be reading a dissenting document, right? And then, of course, now a historical icon, right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as a Supreme Court justice, was very prominent in her belief on certain rights that individuals had, specifically women's rights. She was a pioneer in that field, and so that aspect really comes into play. Okay. One of the reasons that I really want to talk about the New Deal more often when we're talking about the case is because we are going to see a debate about court packing. And in 1937, right, under the New Deal, FDR had been elected president, right? He was serving his then second term. Second term? Because 29 was talking, right? Yeah, second term. So he starts having a lot of his plans, his programs, being deemed unconstitutional by the court. And so he essentially threatens the court to do what's called court packing. And there has been 9 Supreme Court justices for a long time, but as you know, there's no constitutional limit. So the plan was to put a lot of these Supreme Court justices and get so FDR could get the decision that he wanted. Because of this, right, the Supreme Court sort of moderated. Now, in 2012 and 2015, right, there was a concern by Chief Justice Roberts that if the Affordable Care Act was struck down by the Supreme Court, then the executive branch might work harder to sort of pack the court, right? And so Chief Justice John Roberts really played, it is believed that he played this role where he tried to balance the institutional interests of the court and the actual constitutionality. So he played more of a moderate, so it was more difficult for anyone's side to suggest that the court was not doing their job, right? And this happened. And now, right, because of the way seats were allotted and because of concerns about a very conservative justice, for whatever reason, right, there are questions if Biden will try and pack the court. Now, oh my God, okay, just ignore that. One of the aspects that we see, right, is that when you have a new person come in, they really want to change things, and the court might say that's unconstitutional, right? So they really try and see what happens. Okay. So the other part about this is that political expertise and governmental expertise do not overlap, right? I don't think there are any exceptions today, but none of the justices have served in the legislature, right? Congress and the Supreme Court justices, they do not overlap. And because they don't overlap, their expertise is different, but also the way they approach certain things are very, very different. So Congress will often ask, right, for a law to be passed that the Supreme Court would deem unconstitutional because they have different goals, right? And they don't have the same experience. So for some legislators, they don't even know whether or not the Supreme Court would find it unconstitutional, right? That's not their expertise, that's not their understanding, and that's not really what they're going for. So that lack of overlapping experience, right, sometimes explains why so much legislation is problematic when it gets to the Supreme Court. Okay, so now there are 2 different ways to be a Supreme Court justice according to this text, right? There are a little more than that, but in this text there's at least 2. The first part is judicial restraint. Now, judicial restraint is sort of these originalists. This is Justice Scalia. This is believed to be the new Justice Coney Barrett, right? That they're going to be showing restraint. That they're going to say that they're just going to go with the clear words of the Constitution. They're not going to interpret it. They're not going to try to adapt it to the modern day. They're not going to say, well, this is what the Constitution said, but we also provide equality. No, judicial restraint is just saying I'm only going to go off of the words that are on the text of the Constitution. I apologize if that's loud. The things in here are turning off and on. I'm still in the classroom, and the technology is not my friend. So they're originalists, right? Just what the wordings are. I'm just going to take that to make sure that that's the meaning. And then what happens is in the 60s and 70s, you have the Brennan Court and the Warren Court, and these are named after the Chief Justice, right? So now we're in the Roberts Court. But in the 60s and 70s, there was the Brennan Court and the Warren Court. And these were much more liberal justices. They were sort of working through a lot of the civil rights issues, right? The Brennan and Warren Courts were during the time of the civil rights movement. And so they were termed with this idea of judicial activism. And what is believed judicial activism does is it takes the Constitution and it says this is the underlying sort of principles, right? This is the idea. But that the courts have to look at that and say, yes, here's the wording, but what did the wording imply? Did it mean that there should be equality for all? And if it says there should be equality, right, inalienable rights, right, inalienable rights, right? Are all people created equal? Is it just men, right? How far is an appropriate way to say this is what is necessary for the Constitution to be apply the actual parts of the Constitution to all the situations that we have. And so sometimes it goes beyond the words of the Constitution. The most obvious example is Roe v. Wade, right? In Roe v. Wade, it was determined that individuals have a right to privacy, right? Not that abortion should be legal or illegal. That's not the argument. The argument is, are bans on abortions constitutional? And the argument was, no, they're not, right? Late term at least, right? Because individuals have a right to privacy stemming from their First Amendment rights, their Fourth Amendment rights, and their Eighth Amendment rights. This creates what is called a right to privacy. And so that's not in the words of the Constitution. So although it has broken out on pro-choice, pro-life terms, the real difference in a Supreme Court justice, the difference between, say, a Scalia and a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right, sort of these iconic justices, right, were that the Scalia branch believed that there are no words for right to privacy in the Constitution, and so therefore there is no right to privacy in the Constitution, right? There's no wording there to do that, right? Whereas on the left, right, and with Bader Ginsburg, right, there is this concept of privacy and equality that is extended from these rights that you naturally get from these things, and therefore that exists, right? You do see today a more clear partisanship and ideology, right? There is no doubt in anyone's mind that Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett are conservative justices, right? That's not a concern, right? In the same way that the Sotomayor, right, the justices appointed by President Obama are also on the left, right? They're liberal, and the ones that are appointed by Trump are conservative. The only aspect of why the Supreme Court is not more involved is because it has very clear limitations, right? It can't use its power in any way on its own initiative. It can only take cases that are allowed to get to their system, right? It has to go through an appeal and end up in the Supreme Court. It has to go to the right clerk, and the Supreme Court justice has to support it, and then it has to be voted into a case, right? There are a lot of cases that don't make it to them, and they can't consider cases that don't at least go into the appeals court, right? They can't take courts of original, they can't go into a case and then go after it immediately in its original jurisdiction, and they can't look at a broad problem, right? This is part of the other aspect. They can only deal with the individuals in the cases. They can't say this system is unconstitutional. No broad social class discussion. That's why Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Right Education were so long apart, but also why they were adjusted in the exact same way. In Plessy versus Ferguson, that individual was not being discriminated against because it was treated as if those two separate sources were equal. And in Brown versus Education, right, it was the individuals, right, who were trying to get an education, who were arguing that the two different schools were fundamentally different through segregation, right? So they were actually providing relief just to those individuals. It was just that by doing so, they showed that other aspects would also be overthrown, right? Sometimes it's not that they say you can't have a ban on same-sex marriage, right, to use that example. It is that they know, right, a courthouse will say this ban on same-sex marriage was unconstitutional. which means that bans on same-sex marriage in the future will probably also be deemed. Therefore, you don't want to have someone appeal it and win, right? That's going to cost the state a lot of money, right? Because when they win an appeal, the court costs are covered, typically. They also have no enforcement powers, right? The security of the Supreme Court actually belongs to another branch. They are appointed by the president, right, and confirmed by the Senate. We just went through one of these, so it should be very clear. And then Congress does have the power to change the size and jurisdiction of the courts, right? The Supreme Court was never created with a number of justices, which means that Congress can say, we're just going to put more people in. Now, we have a sort of split or Republican Senate, so we probably won't see that. But part of this is that if Congress wanted to, it could raise the size of the Supreme Court from 9 to whatever number it felt like adding in. So the first part in its history, right, is judicial review. Marbury versus Madison. We see the courts can deem a law unconstitutional, and because of this, it dramatically changes the behavior of the courts, right? They're really taking up some issues. And then the next part is judicial procedure, right? How do you get a case? How does it go through these clerks? Are these clerks ideologically driven? Or are they trying to find cases that actually need to be reviewed by the Supreme Court? Or are they looking for cases that only support their conservative or liberal ideas when they're giving it to their Supreme Court justice, right? And these clerks work very hard, right? But they're probably ideologically driven. Very few attorneys don't have some strong views, right? You don't go through that whole process and not have some strong views about the law. In the 1980s, we had a very clear shift. It was called fee shifting. And this is the first time where if you can't, right, handle your fees, if what's stopping you from getting justice in the courts is that you can't pay for it, right, the government starts paying for attorney fees, right? This shifts. The next part is a class action suit. So class action suits are when a whole group of people, right, sue something with a common interest. This happens a lot in states that have mandatory breaks. I don't know about Nevada, but in California, if you work more than a few hours, you're supposed to get a 10-minute break. And so what happened is a lot of managers would tell their people not to take 10-minute breaks, or they would tell them to take 5 minutes instead, right? And so then you have thousands and thousands of people who are getting shorted on things they're supposed to be guaranteed by the state or by the country, or minimum wage laws or labor laws or whatever it is. And you have one big group of people. The same thing for, right, the 3M earplugs for soldiers in the military, right, or for military personnel, right? A class action suit is you all come together. Typically, you get a small amount, and then the firm and the people at the head of it get a larger amount. But it forces companies and it forces interests to be responsible for what they do to a large group of people. So class action suits really come up in the 80s and 90s because they provide a way for people who don't have money to come together and get legal help in a way that helps them get relief from a specific issue. And then there were some structural remedies coming into the late 20th and early 21st century, right? If a court does not handle a case right away, especially the Supreme Court or one of the circuit courts, if they believe that their mandate hasn't been fulfilled, they can just hold on to a case, right? They can say, no, this is still ours, we're still deciding on it. And that retention, that retaining of jurisdiction, helps prevent the cases from jumping around, and it also makes sure that individuals and sort of the plaintiffs are heard, right? That court can say, no, you're going to stay with me until we resolve this. And that helps ease a lot of structural issues about cases being bounced around from courthouse to courthouse. Okay, remember that we are an American system with democracy and rule of law. Rule of law means the law applies to everyone. It applies to government workers. It applies to the president. Everyone is supposed to be, right, the de jure, right, the legal process is supposed to apply equally to everyone. We know in practice that wealthier people get better attorneys, right, and they may not be punished as much. We know that minorities are punished more for the same crimes compared to their white counterparts, but at least legally, rule of law is the same for everyone. We know that you go from a trial court, right? A trial court is the only court in which is determined guilt or innocence, right? If you're talking about a civil court, liability, right? Do you owe a certain amount of money for what you've done, right? Are you going to get some compensation? then an appellate court, right? So in an appellate court and in a Supreme Court, the rules are very different. They're not looking to see guilt or innocence. They're seeing is everything done appropriately. Was your Fourth Amendment right violated, right? A lot of you just wrote about Florida versus Jardine, right? That case was a Fourth Amendment case, right? Did that individual, or was it a violation of his right to bring that dog to the person's house, right? Was it a violation of their rights because why did they go there, right? So the Fourth Amendment case is something about appellate court. Was it violated? So we're talking about, was everything done properly? Is it appropriate and is it constitutional? That's the appellate and Supreme Court's job. We talked about the appointment, case selection, and then judicial review, this idea of common law, right? Gideon versus Wainwright, and the Miranda rights, right? These cases, let me go back real quick. These cases play a much larger role in the criminal justice system than many of the laws that passed after, right? Gideon versus Rivera, Escobedo versus Illinois, and Miranda v. Arizona, right? These three really shift the way that law enforcement works because it makes everything formulaic. And by formulaic, I mean officers are expected to follow the same procedure every time, right? They go in, they assess the situation, right? They assess the situation, they make sure there's no violence, they ensure everyone's safety and security first, right? This is I know some of you are going to say that's not really happening. In the law, that is what's expected to happen, right? The procedures are very clear, right? Go in, make sure everything is safe and secure, everyone's safety and security is set up, right? You calm anyone down, you're expected to calm everyone. De-escalation is part of police officer training. And then if someone has to be arrested, you have to tell them that you'll get them an attorney if they need one. You have to tell them they have a Fifth Amendment right to be silent, right? And you have to sort of explain all of their rules to them in such a way that they understand, right? So when you have those aspects, those cases show a much more important aspect of the law than any sort of laws passed in that same time period that tried to reform the law. Okay. So let's go into chapter 16. And we're still a little behind, but I think we'll be okay. So we talked in the past about bureaucracy, and one of the things about bureaucracy is that it did, as part of its job, have to try and maintain the economy. And this is one of those things that is very unique to sort of the 20th and 21st century, is it becomes one of the issues that every time an elected official or a bureaucracy does something, it has to consider its impact on the macroeconomy, right? Will this cause a loss in jobs? Will this cause a problem for small businesses, right? We want a lot of solutions to problems, right? And environmental climate change, right? All of these factors about the climate, all of these factors about our public health, right? We're going through a pandemic right now, and we're trying to balance the pandemic and the unemployment that's attached to the pandemic, right? So trying to balance these two things is very complicated, and so the government plays a very large role in the economy. Now we're going to start with this basic definition, right? So this public policy, it's any law, right, that it's supposed to provide, right, a better economic system, right? And it depends on, right, what the goals are, and it also depends on whether or not you're trying to promote a behavior, right? Why do we see so many lanes, HOV lanes, or lanes that allow electric vehicles? Why do we see actual parking up front for electric vehicles? It's to incentivize electric vehicles. It is believed that they pollute less, or they cause less pollutants, right? And so because of that, right, that they are incentivized. That's public policy. And so there are four fundamental goals. We're talking specifically about the economy, right? You want to promote economic stability. We talked about before about this sort of idea that the economy is going too fast, that you actually slow it down a little bit, right? You don't want a boom and bust cycle. So if you think that people are trying to speculate too much, you raise the interest rate, and then it's harder to get money and harder to speculate, and you slow down the economy, but hopefully you also avoid a bust, right? A bubble growing too fast and popping, and then there's a recession or a depression. You want to stimulate economic growth, and this can happen in a number of ways that we'll discuss, right? It could be through adding money to the system, right? If it's stimulus spending, or providing people with checks directly, or building infrastructure. You want to promote business development. So this is one of the things that is a little more unique to the United States, is the United States spends a lot more time trying to help businesses grow, right? It has a small business aspect, right? A lot of the funding in the first stimulus round to try and make sure that businesses didn't completely collapse was supposed to go to small businesses to help them stay afloat. And then the last part is about protecting employees and consumers. So Ralph Nader was this person, he really made his name in this thing called Unsafe at Any Speed, where he was really pushing for all cars to have seatbelts. This is 20th century, this is a long time ago, right? Ralph Nader's even a little before my time. And Ralph Nader sort of makes his career showing that there needs to be all these health and safety standards. You have to have seatbelts in cars, and cars need to start having the airbags, right? And then he's also doing the same at the same time, right, that you have a lot of these safety standards coming in. You also have more protections, right? That OSHA is a specific agency that does with the safety and health of employees, right? Employees should have protective masks provided for them if they're going to work in a toxic environment, right? We'll talk about whether or not that pandemic is going to apply the same way, right? But there has to be certain aspects of it, right? If an employee has to lift something that's more than like 60, 70 pounds, they need equipment to do that. So why does it matter? Because there's a difference between a public good and a private good. And so a public good is something that the private system, the private market, the invisible hand, whatever language you want to use, is just not being supplied, right? The Postal Service for a long time was a public good, right? Roads are a public good, right? And these are things that the market just wouldn't supply enough of to be really useful, right? And just so you know, sort of a quick, if you wanted to mail a letter, right, especially before 1990, right, before email, right, before email was prominent, and you wanted to speak to someone, you wanted to write a letter, it was very expensive. It was one stamp for you to write a letter to someone else in the world, right? And so writing letters was a very common process, right? If you wanted to communicate, right? You had the phone service, but it was very expensive at the time, right? Long distance was, right? If you called someone who lived 10 miles away, you might have long distance, right? So you have this public good being provided, and now if we look at the Postal Service, it's still mailing out letters, it's doing a lot of other things as well, but one of the things that we found is that things that cost one stamp, or about 40, 50 cents, in the post office cost in FedEx in the private market about $5. And so they're just not being supplied, right? This low cost of shipping is not being supplied, so that's a public good. And then roads, right? The U.S. provided a lot of roads during the Great Depression, right? Private roads were very limited, right? The highway system really comes from a public good in the government. So public goods is something you're trying to provide. And then the other way that we talk about the economy is this idea of GDP, right? So public goods are how do I work with the economy to provide things that won't be provided by the private market. GDP is gross domestic product. So if we took all the services that people do, all of the services we provide, which today, right, the United States is a service economy, right? The food service, right, all the people making and serving your food, right, the bartender, the hairdresser, the stylist, the barber, right? But also the people working in computer science, fixing computers, right, or setting up technology. We are a service economy. So you take all of that and all the goods we produce, and that's sort of the size of our economy. It's a rough size. GDP is not a great metric, but it's sort of the most consistent metric we see used. And so you want to make sure your economy is growing, because if we maintain, right, the United States is the largest economy in the world, if we maintain the largest economy in the world, it gives us a lot of opportunities. So in the Federalist Papers and in other aspects, one of the arguments about, I want to say it's the Report on Agriculture, but I don't think it's Hamilton. A founding father wrote that we can't remain an agricultural society. We have to build up our society. And this is going to come through a couple of things. And so in order to grow the economy, I should have been checking earlier, I apologize. In order to grow the economy, you need a couple things. The first is you need strong investment. And by strong investment, roads is one of those aspects, right? If you build a lot of highways and bridges, then it's easier to get goods in and out of any system, right? It's good, it's cheaper, it's easier to get goods back and forth, and that provides a lot of aspects. And then national defense. So national defense is that if you believe, and we don't really think about this in the United States as much because it has not happened 70 years, 75 years. It's, I think, over 75 years. The last attack really on U.S. soil, now I'm excluding terrorist attacks, but the last attack made by a military personnel was Pearl Harbor. It's the last like actual real attack on United States soil. There are all these little things that we could get into, but because that you have companies and businesses, individuals not worried about an army or some sort of threat coming into the border, right? You more freely travel, you more freely exchange goods. So roads and national defense are strong investment tools. You need technological information. We know ARPANET, we talked about ARPANET before, right? This is where, right, this is precursor to the internet. The military needed some way to communicate if normal communications lines went down, but then they realized it's very useful to be able to pass information very quickly, right? But also the private interest would have gotten there anyways, right? The internet was something that was inevitably going to happen because it's so valuable and so useful to us now. The other part is the National Science Foundation grants. So an NSF grant is something that anyone in my field would love to have, right? This is where the government gives you money through the National Science Foundation to find an answer to a question. And a lot of times it's a question that private companies don't need to answer, right? NSF grants are very useful, right? As a political scientist or in the social sciences, we need to find answers to questions that won't benefit specific companies. And when we're trying to find the answers, they will actually help the basic growth of the economy, but they won't benefit one specific company, right? One of the things that NSF grants might do is what is going to be the need, what are going to be the job needs in the next 5 to 10 years, right? We always know we need more nursing staff, depending on like high quality, highly trained nurses, right? RNs and above, right? RN surgical nurses, things like that, physician assistants. They're always going to be in demand. But what else is demand? Do we need certain aspects? Do we need more manufacturing? What do we need? And by doing those answers, we can better prepare a system. The other part is if you know what the system needs, right? What you'll notice more and more is that we need less and less labor and more highly educated individuals in our service economy, right? It's a service economy, it's no longer a labor economy, and so the more education you have, the more successful you can be, right? I am older and out of shape. I cannot successfully participate in a labor market, right? But I have a good opportunity to find work because I have a lot of education and practice in this field, right? So an educated workforce can do more for you even when they don't always have, right? Because most labor is younger, right? Or right, labor itself can be bad for your body. But as you become more educated, you can do more things. The other aspect is as you become more educated, your skills become more valuable, and then you pay more in taxes because you make more money, right? The United States wants everyone to make more money because it means they pay more in taxes, right? There's a natural benefit, a symbiosis between getting people to do more, be more productive, produce more goods, and also make more money in that process because taxation based on income is how the federal system gets a lot of its funding. Okay. So you have the GDP, that's the size of the economy. You have all these public works to make sure that the economy is running. So now we're going to talk about people getting employed. And so you introduce this idea, this argument made by John Maynard Keynes, and it's called John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian economics. And so what Keynes would argue is that the best way to make sure that your economy is running smoothly is to have full employment. And full employment means that you have 5% or less unemployment, right? Not that everyone has a job, right? But that there's less than 5% of the people looking for jobs can't find them at any given moment, right? The reason is you're always going to have sort of transitional unemployment, right? Some people quit their job to try out something new, or some people get fired and then it takes them a while, or you have layoffs in one company and they have to retrain and transition to another job. And so you're always going to have some unemployment, but 95% employment or 5% unemployment, right, is a pretty good metric. In order to keep at full employment, to keep the economy going, Keynesian economics says that when things are bad, the government should spend money to get spending, right? Should increase spending and should cut taxes to free up more money so the economy can go, right? Now, part of this is cutting taxes has been a thing that has become more of a conservative value, right? Conservatives believe less taxation in general. So cutting taxes is harder because you already have so much taxation cut that you can't really cut it much lower and still provide the services that we provide. But when things are bad, what we have seen multiple times now, right? TARP relief, right? And the recession, all the money that went out, $1 trillion, right? When we talk about, right, in this year, right, all the money went out, that in order to keep the economy going, the government has multiple times stepped in and said, okay, we're going to give money, we want you to build bridges or build roads, or we're just going to give this money to businesses as forgivable loans, right? Because it doesn't really matter how the money is spent as long as the money keeps people spending and keeps people producing, right? And so that's the Keynesian argument. At one point, Nixon, who was not a Keynesian, was very much against this aspect, and it became clear that all of his counterparts had been won over by John Maynard Keynes, right? And he says, well, I guess we're all Keynesians now, right? He says, we're all Keynesians now. And it was this idea that anytime you have a negative downturn in the economy, right, whenever the economy goes down, the government's going to step in. Now, unemployment is how much people are at work and producing. GDP is the size of the economy. And then inflation is how much the value of a dollar is changing from one year to the next, right? This is an increase in the general level of prices, right? So the way that we sort of calculate this is we take a basket of food, right? And this basket represents the normal purchasing of food in a household, right? Sort of average purchasing, some bread, some milk, eggs, all of those things, right? Now it's adjusted a little bit in the 21st century, and obviously it doesn't match everyone's household, right? I would never buy eggs or milk. But what we look at is, has that price increased from the last year? And if that price is increasing about 2 to 3%, that's good. You want some inflation, right? Some inflation is good. A low percentage, 2 to 3% is good. Because what you want is the value of the dollar to be in slight decline every day. Because if you think that your money is going to be worth less in the future, you're going to spend it. Excuse me. So part of this is you want people spending the money they have. You don't want them hoarding the money. So you want it to be a tiny bit less valuable each year, right? And that forces people to spend. You don't want hyperinflation where money's losing value so fast that people don't even deal with it, or they need a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. That's bad. And you don't want deflation, because then people will hoard money because it's gaining value just by existing, right? So you want about 2 to 3%. That's the ideal inflation rate for the level of prices of sort of a general basket of goods. So how do we promote business, right? We talked about sort of getting the economy going. How do we promote specific businesses? And this has been done since the New Deal era through categorical grants, right? That I'm going to say you can spend money, but you can only do it for a specific thing, right? And this was first through the National Highway System. What happened is, what we saw historically is that the federal government would go to a state and say, we think you need to have a highway here to improve your connection of your cities, to get more business flowing through your state, right? You need a highway through here. And we're going to pay part of the cost, and you're going to pay the other part of the cost. But by building this highway, even though it costs you money, right, you're going to get to hire and employ all of these people. And so you're going to have more people working, right, sort of working at their job, doing more work, getting more productivity, and keeping the economy going. This started with just larger businesses, right, and just sort of getting people back to work through this highway system. And then in 1953, you start the Small Business Administration. And the Small Business Administration has different problems because these companies, they can't hold off for a few months, right? Most small businesses only have about 60 days worth of capital. So by shutting down for 60 days, we probably killed 20% of the small businesses exist in the United States, right? A shutdown was very, very painful for small businesses. So this administration, the Small Business Administration, finds a way for small businesses to survive in an environment that they otherwise would die, right? That they have no control over, right? No one in the United States had any control over the pandemic when it first got here, sort of January, February, March, right? Since then, right, we've sort of been our own worst enemy when it comes to not going out or being careful or other aspects, right? But in that first month, there was no way of knowing how quickly the layperson, right? A small business owner. Now, the government might have known, but a small business owner would not have known what to do in that situation. And then they were forced to shut down for a period of time, right? And then they need some help getting back on their feet or not closing, right? And so that's provided by the Small Business Administration. Sematech was a bit more unique example. There was a belief that, right, that we were too reliant on foreign microchips. We wanted to have our own sort of manufacturer, but also, right, that this company was going to go under, and it was sort of the last sort of American opportunity. And because of that, right, there's a lot of push to make sure that Sematech was this open option for the U.S. in case it needed to produce its own aspect, right? The U.S. does this a lot, right? We have oil reserves. We have a lot of resources tied up that you can't use, right? That you can't mine for, you can't get out. And the whole point is that the U.S. has to be able to provide something if its normal producer suddenly decides it doesn't want to help, right? This is a security interest, right? You never want to be in a position where you can't use your technology or your weapon systems or your defense mechanisms because another country is providing you with something that you needed. The next part is In-Q-Tel. So in the 20th century, because In-Q-Tel is kind of it's not the name of it anymore, but also you don't see this as much. The CIA would identify high-tech startups, right, that had not just a good chance for return on investment, right? So the first thing In-Q-Tel would say, okay, if we invest in this startup, this startup, it's going to maybe produce money. But the other part is that the startup may be producing something that the CIA or other intelligence apparatus need, right? Other intelligence agencies might say, we need this technology that is being produced by this firm. So we, as a government capital firm, we can risk a little bit of money, and if it's not profitable, that's okay, as long as it still ends up producing this product. And In-Q-Tel was very, very successful, right? It actually didn't make a good deal of money because of the model that it used, but what it did do is it produced a lot of technology specifically for the intelligence agency. So these companies didn't have a lot of buyers, right? They couldn't just sell their product to the open market. Civilians don't want their product, right? If it's a listening device or some way to spy from 1,000 miles away, whatever it is, but the companies would do fairly well and not lose too much money, not gain too much money, but what they would end up as a product that the intelligence agency could use to do their job better. And so sometimes promoting business also means promoting national security. The next part is this idea of protecting employees and consumers. So it wasn't until 1935 and 1938 that you have sort of labor standards and relations change. I know I have this question. I don't think it matters anymore. It used to be this question was like minimum wage or something, like, but I don't think it impacts anymore the way that it used to. So you have these aspects, and these are about sort of basic standards and then sort of an ability for individuals to unionize, to come together. All right? Before the 1930s, if farmers decided that they were going to unionize or form a collaborative, sometimes the government would go and send in people and beat them up or kill them, right? And this was because the government understood that if the farmers or certain labor groups, if they come together as part of a union, the cost of that product might go up a little bit, or significantly depending on what product it is. So because of that, there was a really push against a unionization or organizing of these certain industries. Now, eventually in the 30s, what the acts passed, but then what eventually becomes is that you have a right to assembly, right? Eventually, the 14th Amendment makes it very clear in the 1960s and 1970s that everyone has a right to assembly, and because you have a right to assembly, that also means that people can meet up to form a union, right? They have a right to meet up in any group that they so choose, right? If you and your friends want to meet up, right, there are limitations, right? This is why saying you can only have 10 people in your house or in a group setting, right? It technically violates your right to assembly, but Supreme Court might rule differently because it's a health epidemic rather than sort of a labor dispute. What they did decide in those cases, right, that those individuals have a right to assembly, and assembling that leads to organization is something that is protected, right? So this is how unions really start up. The courts and these acts really sort of come together on their system. In the beginning of the sort of the turn of the 20th century, coming right into the 20th century, Upton Sinclair writes this expose. I think it eventually becomes a book, but it starts as expose. And it's in the meatpacking industry. And a couple of things that he notices is, one, it's really dirty. It's really, really dirty in the meatpacking industry. Like, there's a lot of risks involved. Remember, this is not sort of modern day meatpacking. And obviously I'm biased, right? I don't eat meat, and I'm a vegan, so I'm going to be a little biased. But one of the things that we can look at today is that it's much more sterile, right? Whether or not it's humane, whether or not it's cruel, that's not the language we're going to use today, right? It's sterile, it's clean, right? They clean everything. They use bleach. They make sure that they don't cross-contaminate, right? These are all requirements in the 21st century. What you see in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, is that there's no cleaning going on. There's tons of cross-contamination. There's listeria. There's all of these diseases that people are getting because the meatpacking industry is not getting there. Now, one of the things that's weird about Upton Sinclair is this is when the first time when they start hearing complaints that the workers are sick, right? And we know in the United States that people go to work sick all the time. It's a very different concept than the rest of the world, right? But his expose led to one of the first setups where you started thinking we needed standards to make sure our food was safe, right? And so his expose of the jungle, it becomes one of the first precursors of understanding why we need an FDA or a USDA and all of these factors to make sure that the food we're eating is safe. And then I've already talked about Ralph Nader's unsafe at any speed, right? He showed that even at very low speeds, low as like 15, 20 miles an hour, if you got into a car accident with no seatbelt and no airbag, you could die, right? You could be going 20 miles. And remember, these are much older cars. They're made out of metal, right? They're very hard dashes, right? They're not designed to be safe, right? There's no safety concerns at the beginning. So Ralph Nader really points out that airbags and seatbelts are necessary in vehicles, and now you can't make a vehicle without all those things unless it's sort of a kit car. There are exceptions, right? But any company that makes a vehicle has to have airbags and seatbelts and wants a very high safety rating, right? A safety rating is very important today. It was not in the past. So here we have a shift, right? In the 20th century, we have a shift from what originally was called laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire, just sort of like leave alone, right? And you start with, before you have the Ralph Naders and the Upton Sinclairs, and all these individuals come together and say the government has to come in and protect us. You have a lot of the people that are arguing about this, what's called invisible hand, right? And the invisible hand of the market is that there's a natural sort of order to the market that sort of determines how things happen, that determines which businesses succeed. And if you mess with the invisible hand, if you sort of artificially try and change the way an economy works, it's going to be detrimental, right? And so by having everything privately owned and for profit, you really get more economic growth. Now you do, right? We know that the less regulation, right, the less taxation, the more economic growth you have, but you also have worse working conditions, you have lower wages, right? It's a balancing system. Do you want a much greater economy, or do you want sort of more climate controls, right? Now we have green jobs and things like that, right? But you're always doing this trade-off. Laissez-faire did not do that trade-off. Turn of the century, beginning of the 20th century was all about growing economy. It did not care about environment or labor rules. Now, the other part about this is supply-side economics. And supply-side economics is a very specific thing that comes about in the 80s that says if you lower the rate of taxation, then the productive capacity for individuals and firms and companies would go up, right? That they will do more business, right? What this became called in the 1980s was called Reaganomics, right? Reaganomics and this idea of a trickle-down theory. And so the argument for supply-side economics is you lower the tax rate, and then companies and businesses and individuals do more work and they produce more because they're not discouraged by high taxes. And then when they make more, they'll spend more. And by spending more, eventually it'll get down to the lower classes. Now, there's no evidence to really support that. Supply-side economics and Reaganomics and trickle-down theory have not been supported by the evidence. We had for a long period of time a low taxation rate, much lower, right? Remember, when Kennedy was president, the highest taxation rate was 90%, 92%, right? So anything over a certain, I think over $1 million, got taxed at 92%. So if you made more than $1 million a year, everything after that basically went to the government under President Kennedy as president. It drops down to 40%. So a 50% rate drops down to 40% by the time we see Clinton, and it continues to go down, right? So we did have supply side economics. We did not see the lower social classes or less, our unskilled labor do better, right? There was no trickle down that we saw. And in fact, we know now that the middle class shrank under this rather than grew, right? Supply side economics is not really that supported by the evidence we have. So we have these two problems, right? We have that we need more services and we want smaller government, right? Our preferences are just problematic. So we talked about this in Nevada already, right? That we don't have income tax in Nevada, we want all these services. The same is true for the federal government. All individuals want smaller government and they want fewer services. They just disagree on which services, right? As part of being in Las Vegas, the services that we think are very important are different than those individuals living in Colorado or New York or California, right? We all disagree. And so every individual, if you talk to them, will talk about something that needs to be taken out of government or do less, right? And something that's more important to them. And because they don't align, this causes it to be very difficult, where everyone wants their services, but they don't want to pay for the larger government system. Now, because we have decreased revenue, right, we did lower taxes, and we continue to lower taxes. The Trump administration lowered taxes last year, right, or at the beginning of last year, right? There was a tax decrease, I think maybe twice during his administration there was a tax decrease. So you have a decrease in taxes, which means you're bringing in less revenue, but you have trillions of dollars of problems that you need to solve, right? You have to stimulus checks, right? Stimulus during the recession between 2008 and 2012, right? You have wars that you have to pay for. And so, right, in 2018, the deficit was $440 billion. Now, what does that mean? That means that in the year of 2018, in the fiscal year of 2018, in those 12 months, because it's like October 1st to, right, August 30th, right? I think it starts in October. It's still 12 months, but it doesn't start in January 1st. So it's a fiscal year, but it's still 12 months. In that 1 year, the United States government spent $440 billion more than it took in. It had a $4 trillion budget. Right? That's a lot of money coming in. That's a significant amount. Because of that, right, because it's using deficit spending, it's borrowing more and more and more. And so now, right, the United States government, right, and split among the entire U.S. national debt, is $20 trillion. Now, how does this debt work, right? The United States is in $20 trillion worth of debt, but it is not all government debt, right? In fact, a big portion of this is personal debt. So the way that we look at how much debt the nation is in is we look at all of the loans granted to people and the debt that is connected to the U.S. government. And so this is now $20 trillion. Now, some people have argued that it's so high that it's going to start creating a problem for our economy. I don't know if there's any evidence of that. That's an economist would have a better answer to that. But what we do know is that there's so much in debt that now we have to start assigning a certain amount of money to paying off that debt, right? Which is only going to reinforce this problem, right? If you ever have been in this situation before, right, you take out a loan that you can't really pay back, a payday loan being the worst type, or you have a credit card, and then all of a sudden for months after that, you have less income because you're still trying to pay off that credit card or the payday loan, right? That takes a toll on your economic ability. So we are in that position now with the amount of debt that we have in the United States. Okay. So we did talk about fiscal policy, right? That's sort of interest rates, right? Other factors, right? When we're talking about monetary policy, this is where you alter the supply of how much money and credit is. We actually talked about this. I I hope I'm not repeating too much. Okay. So I'll just go over it, and then if we cover it again in review, it never hurts to review. So you have a Federal Reserve System, and these are just banks that control how much money is coming in and out of the system. And what I mean is the physical currency, but also how much credit's going out, right? And we talked about this before, so it makes me feel like we already did this, but it must have been another section. The chairman of the Federal Reserve decides the prime interest rate. And so if you want less lending, you raise the prime interest rate. If I want the lowest percentage rate you can borrow and the lowest percentage rate you can get when you borrow to be 5%, I'll set the prime rate at 3%, right? Because banks borrow at 3% and then loan to the individual at 5%, right? They always want some sort of gain on their interest, and they need some sort of backer, right? The Federal Reserve's back all of this to make sure there's enough liquidity to move everything around, or enough assets to move everything around and to be covered. If you want more people borrowing, then you lower the prime interest rate. So the Federal Reserve System is a way for the government to change how much people are borrowing and to change how much cash is in the system. By having more money in the system, it makes it easier for you to exchange bills and therefore easier to exchange in economic systems and sales. But it also means that there's more cash moving around, which is harder to track, right? So you want to limit it, and it also raises inflation, right? If you put too much money in the system, inflation goes up, and then those dollars are worth less. Not nothing, but less. We also have open market operations. Sometimes we talk about just these being bonds. So basically, the government will sell a bond or security or some sort of other asset or economic sort of identity, right? Because a security bond, they're just pieces of paper, right? Sort of debt guaranteed. But by doing so, you can change the amount of money circulating, right? If you want people to have less money circulating, you put out these bonds or these securities and you pull money into those. Or, right, you can sell them or pay them out to get more money going through the system. So an open market registration really helps change how much money is moving through, but it has to be done in such a way that you're buying some sort of security or some sort of bond in order to get certain things going. Sometimes you use the bonds to do other things, right? We have seen bond measures that are used to build schools or roads, right? The bond measure that built the Thomas and Mack, right? That was an open market operation, right? So you have the Thomas and Mack, you had a bond measure, it was passed. You as students are still paying for it, even though it is then being built and it has all this money that it's brought in, you're still helping pay for it, right? To sort of get that operation going, and hopefully it fosters a better economy. You can foster investment. And so this is one of the things that came up after the Great Depression. A lot of banks had a run on money. And so if you had money in your bank account, it could just disappear until the 1940s and going into the 1950s. And so FDIC is just insurance. And it says if something happens to your bank, right, not hackers stealing it, but if your bank, your actual bank has a default and they take your money, up to $250,000 will be insured by the federal government, right? It's federal deposit insurance. So it's not protection from hackers. It's just that if you have money in your account, the bank has to honor it. If the bank won't honor it, the government will back it. And that's how people trust banks and put their money in banks. And you want people putting their money in banks so that the banks can do something. They can invest with it or buy stocks with it, right? So they can try and get that money to make more money. They also do guarantees on mortgages. So this became the reason why the recession was so bad. At times, the government will guarantee a mortgage depending on the type of mortgage it is. A subprime house, right? If someone bought a house with a subprime loan, it means the interest rate on the loan was lower than the prime interest rate at the time, right? It was possible to do this in a subprime as a subprime rate. What we saw is that a lot of individuals, because they could borrow at a very low interest rate, they didn't have to worry as much about, right, making sure they could pay it back quickly. because they weren't losing any real money. And what happened is a lot of speculation occurred, and people who couldn't afford those houses bought those houses, right? Even people who couldn't afford them sort of got into the game. And what happened is you had all of these homes that no one could really pay for unless they were going to flip at a high rate. And we already talked about income wasn't on the rise, and housing markets were on the rise very quickly, and it created this housing bubble. And what happens is when all of a sudden, all this cascading effects that none of these people can afford their homes, and then it creates all these problems, all of a sudden the banks are stuck with all of these guaranteed mortgages that are definitely not going to get paid back, right? All of these loans, the mortgage is a loan where the house is the asset, sort of backing the loan, but the house isn't worth what the loan was made for, and so you have all these problems where banks can no longer support themselves. And what happens is you have to have over $1 trillion in emergency loans paid out to mostly banks, right? $700 billion going to the banks, right? Sort of rescuing them from these risky loans, despite the fact that they were the ones who involved themselves in these risky loans, right? So this continues to be a problem, right? Certain aspects of the economy put a lot of risk on the system by sort of looking at bubbles and looking at inflation or looking at aspects that may not be appropriate, right? And there are movies about the subprime crisis. There are like 3 movies. There are actually a lot of movies right now about banking itself, so you could watch just any one of them. It is, some of them very interesting, but some of them are very, very dull and dry, and you would be better off sort of getting a sort of fictionalized or stylized version rather than try and read into them, unless that's what you're going to go into, because then you have to do so much research and so much detail that you would end up being a specialist in that aspect. So when we're talking about monetary policy, we're talking about how you regulate how much money and credit is in the system. When you're talking about fiscal policy, you're talking about how much taxation and spending occurs. So monetary policy is control of the currency, the exchange of currency, and how much credit is out. Fiscal policy is the more common policy tool that we've talked about, and that's taxation, right? How much is the taxation rate, and how much are you spending specifically on helping people get goods and services? And these are designed to help change the economy, slow it down, speed it up, whatever that is. A tariff is just a tax on imported goods, right? When we talk about a tariff, what's important is it's a one-way tax, right? A tariff is a tax on goods that are coming into the country, right? We don't tax goods going out of the country. That's for other countries to do, right? When you send a good to Egypt, Egypt puts a tax on that good coming from the United States, right? So it's a one-way system. You don't want goods coming from other countries because that damages our GDP. So we want to put in barriers, right? A tariff is a barrier to keep foreign goods from coming in, right? Not from specific countries, from all countries, right? You want the least amount of imports and the maximum of exports. Now, for the United States, for the last 30 years at least, we've had more imports than exports. We have more goods coming in, right? We don't like that. Right? That's not a good place to be in, but our economy is so large and so service-based where we trade between each other, right? Our trading is more likely to occur between Nevada and Utah or between individuals than to go outside the United States, right? There's this microcosm or it's macrocosm that exists in the United States. The imports and exports aren't as big of a deal because they don't make such a huge portion of the GDP. Progressive taxation is the way that we would describe income tax. And since I have this screen share, let's see if I can't actually find a way to describe this to you that's useful. Okay, so no questions so far. We're gonna okay, hold on one second. I thought I had this tool, but the computer only lets me have to install everything. So progressive taxation is just so that the more that you make, you start hitting brackets for higher taxation. I don't think I can do this without let's just use an Excel spreadsheet. No, that's going to take too long. Okay, I apologize. If you make less than 20,000 a year, right, that 20,000 is taxed at 18%, or nothing, depending on if you're like at the poverty level. So everyone pays, every single individual who makes up to 20,000 pays the same tax rate for that 20,000. So it's progressive, right? Because the next 20,000 is at a higher tax rate. So people who make more money pay a higher tax rate in that bracket, but they don't pay more money on the first 20,000, right? Only in the second 20,000 do they pay a higher interest rate. You can never, some people say like, oh, I would make less by making more. That's nonsense, right? You don't pay 40% on every dollar you make. Only the top amount of money that you're making are you paying, right? Only after $100,000 do you start getting taxed at a higher rate, right? And it's only the money that you make after 100,000, right? So everything up to 100,000, some tax rate. 100,000, that $101 to the $200,000, that section of your income is taxed at a higher rate. And it's based on this idea of the marginal utility of the dollar. And so the way the marginal utility of the dollar works is the first dollar you get is very valuable to you, right? Think about it, you have no money, start from zero. You have no money and you're hungry and you get $5. That first $5 makes it so you're not hungry anymore. The next $5 to make sure you're not thirsty anymore. And then as you get a little more, you have shelter and you have, right, basic transportation to get where you need to go, right? And you start building on the things you need. By the time you start taking care of all those things, once you get to the 10th or 11th need, then you start reaching things that, okay, I don't need this, but I want this, right? And that's the marginal utility of the dollar. The 100th dollar you make is worth less than the first dollar you make. And so progressive taxation takes that into account and therefore applies in such a way the more money you make at the higher brackets, you're also taxed more heavily. And that makes it so only the dollars that matter less to you, right, are taxed at a higher rate, right? If you make $100,000, right, the next $10,000 you make, those aren't going to food or basic shelter, right? Those are going to go to other things that you may want. And so there's dollars to you, right? And the way that the marginal utility is argued is those dollars mean less to you because you've already made, right, more and more money, right? Each dollar is worth less than the first one, right? Because of that need-based purchasing, right? The first dollar you get helps you survive. The $100,000 you get helps you have something fun, right? And so that's less valuable to you. And that's the marginal utility of the dollar. And I'm explaining this very quickly. It's definitely oversimplified, but I don't want to get too much into it because marginal utility of the dollar is just a much larger concept. I don't expect you to know it. I do expect to know progressive taxation, right? And then it's brackets. It's not, if you make $100,000, all the money you get is taxed at 34%. It's the money $80,000 to $100,000 that's taxed at 34%. And that first $20,000 is still taxed at 18%. And so each bracket has a higher taxation rate. Now the opposite of that is regressive taxation. And regressive taxation is that you pay more taxes the lower your income. And sales tax is a regressive tax, right? If you make less, very little, and you're going to take your only $5 and you're going to buy food, and the tax on that, right, is 10%, then you're paying 10% of all of your money to taxes, right, for a basic necessity that is food. If you have $100,000 and you pay 10% tax on sales, but only $5 is going to food, then less percentage of your money is going to that taxation, right? That's regressive taxation. So regressive taxation hits lower income brackets more heavily, and sales tax is the most obvious one, right? That's not normative, that's just, right? Poorer people spend more of their income on sales tax relative to what people, wealthier people spend on sales tax, right? It's regressive taxation. So if you have a problem where you have regressive taxation and you have, right, not to sort of bring up communist ideas, but right, when you have the people who own the means of production, right, you have wealthy individuals, you have corporations, right, you will end up, part of this capitalism that you end up with some people who have way more than they need, and you have some people who don't have anything, right? And then you have this idea of redistribution. And redistribution is where I'm going to tax those people who have not more than they need, because that's still value-based, but enough to survive after being taxed, right? It doesn't change their quality of life to be taxed, right? That they can still have a good life and be taxed. And then you take that money and you find a way to bring it to people at the lowest income bracket to try and decline the amount of severity between those two groups, right? So it is taking from the rich and giving to the poor, but it is done in such a way, is intentionally tried to do in such a way to where you try to decrease the amount of difference between the wealthiest and the poorest, right? And it really is determined by who has the highest income bracket, right? Redistribution occurs mostly through corporations and larger interests being taxed, and that money going to very poor people in their interest, right? But the idea behind redistribution is not that you just take from the wealthy people and give to poor people, is that you use that money that you got from the wealthy people to help elevate poor people, right? It's called social mobility, right? That you try and take people at a very low level and you try to make sure that they have opportunities to be more successful, right? And the most obvious example of redistribution is actually education, right? If many of you could not go to school without funding, right? That you don't have the thousands of dollars every semester right now to pay for it. So for a lot of you, the only way that you were even going to get to go to a school was going to be by getting some sort of loan or some sort of grant. And a lot of those grants and loan money that comes from taxation of wealthy people throughout the country, and then using that to provide for your income education, right? For your tuition and your loans and all of those things. Now, one of the aspects that's very common in fiscal policy is there is always a loophole, right? The one that's sort of more mythological rather than real is a business expense, right? What can you cost off, right? If you were a private business, right? If you're a small business and you own that business, you want to create a lot of business expenses to offset your profits. You want to show that you produced very little profits while also making a lot of profits. So when someone says, I'm going to expense this, that means I'm going to offset my profits with the expense of this, often for dinners, right? I'm going to treat this as a business dinner, right? And then I'm going to say, whatever the dinner was, $200, $300, that should go against what I made. You can't tax me on that because it cost me that amount of money to do that. Now that's sort of the mythological explanation. The larger explanation is if you spend $10 million making $12 million worth of revenue, you shouldn't be taxed on $12 million. You should be taxed on $2 million because you only made $2 million, right? Your profits was only $2 million. And so by looking at the business expenses, you can find a lot of ways to make it seem like you made less money by showing all of these expenses that you made. The last part is corporate inversion, and this was a kind of a weird thing. I want to say corporate inversion is this thing where you could get benefit by moving your individuals off United States soil. But, right, remember that these are just any loophole that allows taxation to be declined, right? Basically, in the 90s and the 2000s, it's still true that many companies can take a job in the United States, fire the United States worker, hire someone in a foreign country, and get a tax write-off for it. So it's very problematic. Okay. I don't know if you can tell, but I am definitely losing my voice. So we are at budget deficit. We're actually really close to catching up. I'm not worried about getting exactly there because the last one's about foreign relations, and it doesn't matter how much time we have. I'm going to go way over time. That is something I love very much. So I'm going to make sure that there is a review quiz. If you need to email me, right, I have my phone. I'm here, obviously. If you're having problems with this type of video, if it's not coming through clearly, let me know. I'm also going to post a couple of videos. I actually have my own little whiteboard because I'm a nerd. Like in my house, I have a whiteboard, and I want to post videos explaining some of these concepts. So when you see a video, from this point moving forward, if it is a screen share, right, as you're looking at right now, that's a video that is testable material. If you see me talking in front of a whiteboard, that's going to be more explanatory, right? I won't test you anything that because I'm going to talk to you about marginal utility. I want to explain these concepts. So some of the videos, these type of videos that you're seeing right now, make sure you watch these, make sure you do the chapters, make sure you're prepared for this final exam, because a lot of you are going to need it to get a much better grade or need it to pass, right? It is the last opportunity. And after the final exam, there's only about 48 hours before I submit grades, so then it's too late. So make sure you're doing that. If you're having trouble with some of the concepts and you want some clarity, there'll be other videos that are posted on my whiteboard where I can actually draw it out, and it's a little easier. I am not technologically savvy, as is obvious. The other part is that if you got a bad grade on the paper and you're like, this is all I need to do better, or I really misunderstood, right? I am going to make more time. I'm sort of breaking my own rule, but because we had to shut down again, this was supposed to be in person, and you were guaranteed in person, I want to set something off to where you don't feel sort of cheated by the system changing, because there's not a lot we can do. I am still here, but don't come in. Where if you need to rewrite it, email me first. Do not submit without contacting me first, but make sure we have a communication about what is necessary for you to get a better grade. And for some of you, you will be seeing emails in the next couple of hours where I'll be explaining to you what I need from you in order to justify helping you get to the next grade level, whatever it is, right? The lower your grade is, the more likely I'm going to be sort of pressing you and on top of you to do better, right? If you're still concerned and you're like at a 92 and you're like, I need an A, you're going to have to reach out to me this week. And then in the coming weeks, the number of people that I'm communicating will decline. As we go closer into COSO's finals week, I want to get everyone where they want to be, right? And I want to be very clear about this. Not everyone has to get an A, right? That doesn't have to be the goal. I want that goal for you. My class is easy enough that you can get an A, but I want you to put in the effort you need, because if it's between getting an A in here or making sure you pass anatomy, make sure you pass anatomy, right? Just try and figure out where you need to be, right? If you have a B plus and you're like, I don't care, I'm fine with a B plus, I'm okay with that too. Just make sure that you're communicating with me when I'm reaching out to you and saying this is what I think you need to do to do better. Make sure we're communicating very clearly to get you the best possible outcome. Okay, I think that's it for today. I'm going to see if I can end this, and hopefully it just sort of shuts down. Have a good day.